Sing something for us, Marcia." That's what Nicholas said, into a microphone, at his own wedding. She was 7 months pregnant, standing in front of 200 people. What she sang, no one ever forgot. Nicholas Harrell wanted one thing, to humiliate the woman who carried his child. His ex-wife, Marcia Douglas, had been uninvited, then re-invited, only to be used as entertainment. But what Nicholas didn't know was that Marcia had a voice that could silence guilt, and a secret that would turn his perfect day into a living nightmare. And it all started with a single note. If someone tried to humiliate you publicly, would you shrink or strike back? And if your heart had already been shattered, how far would you go to reclaim your dignity in front of the world? Keep watching. Because Marcia, she didn't just sing. Before we dive in, where are you watching from, and what kind of story do you want to see next? Drop it in the comments. And if stories like this pull you in and don't let go, go ahead, hit subscribe. I have another powerful one coming tomorrow. Now, let's get into the story. Why would he invite her? That question clung to the air like perfume, thick and lingering, passing from one pair of lips to another in hushed tones and sideways glances, eyes darting toward the woman in red who stood quietly at the back of the room. Her belly unmistakable, her silence louder than the music echoing faintly off the ivory walls. She didn't belong here, at least. Not according to most of the faces staring at her like a misstep in an otherwise perfect painting. She was 7 months. Pregnant and glowing in a way that had nothing to do with happiness. Her hands resting softly over her stomach as if shielding something sacred in the middle of a room filled with people who would rather pretend she didn't exist. The irony was thick, because once, she had been the woman they toasted to, the woman whose smile had once lit up this same ballroom, but that was before the betrayal, before the lies. Before Nicholas Harrell decided to marry someone else just months after walking out on her without a goodbye. She hadn't even planned on showing up, in fact. The invitation had gone straight into the trash the first time she saw it, cream-colored, gold-embossed, with her name written in that all-too-familiar cursive that had once scribbled love notes on napkins. But days later, a second envelope arrived, this one handwritten, no RSVP card, just a folded piece of paper with Nicholas' sharp handwriting slashing across it. Foreclosure, it said, and somehow, those 2 words dug deeper than any apology ever could. It wasn't just an invite, it was a dare, and maybe a trap, but something in her, pride, anger, maybe even a twisted sense of curiosity, made her pick out the red dress, the one color she knew would make her impossible to ignore, and show up. She hadn't seen him in person since the day he packed his bags while she stood barefoot in the kitchen, hands trembling. A positive pregnancy test sitting on the counter like an unspoken confession neither of them had the guts to say out loud. He left anyway, and then he moved on, quickly, publicly, like she had been a phase, a mistake, a name he could delete from his history without consequence. But the baby growing inside her wasn't a memory she could erase. It was a life, a future, a heartbeat that reminded her daily of everything she had lost and everything she still had to protect. Now, standing in the back of that wedding hall, beneath chandeliers that sparkled like nothing had ever gone wrong, Marcia Douglas could feel every stare slicing across her skin, like she was the villain in someone else's fairy tale, as if they'd all forgotten who Nicholas had been to her first. He was her husband before he was anyone's groom, her heartbreak before he was anyone's hero, and yet here she was, invited on purpose, under the guise of healing, when deep down she knew Nicholas didn't want closure, he wanted a performance. And in that moment, as the music faded and his eyes found hers across the sea of well-wishers and white roses, she understood the truth. This wasn't about forgiveness or moving on. It was about humiliation, spectacle, control. It was about reminding her that he was still in charge of the narrative, that she would always be the footnote in his success story. The ex-wife who showed up pregnant to his wedding like a bad plot twist. But what Nicholas didn't realize was that Marcia had rewritten the ending, and she wasn't here to blend into the background. She was here because sometimes, the person you try to silence walks into the room with something to say. And the moment would come when all the fake smiles would crack, when the truth would pierce through the carefully curated perfection of that day, when her voice, the very thing he thought he could use to shame her, would become the weapon that shattered every illusion he had built around himself. But for now she waited, one hand on her belly, the other holding onto her composure, wearing red not for attention but for power, and as whispers swirled like smoke around her, she looked ahead toward the altar where he stood, grinning like a man who thought he'd won, unaware that his victory was about to unravel, note by note, word by word, in front of every soul who thought they knew the story. The real performance hadn't even started yet. Back then, before betrayal had a name and heartbreak had a face, before red dresses carried weight and microphones held vengeance. They were just two students colliding under the weight of shared dreams and cheap textbooks. Marcia met Nicholas Harrell during sophomore year on a rainy Tuesday in the university library. She was tucked away in the literature section, fingers tracing the spine of a worn poetry collection, and he tall, confident, with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. Reached for the same book without looking. Their hands touched for barely a second, but something about that moment sparked, not in a fireworks and music kind of way, but in the quiet way someone looks at you and sees not just who you are but who you could become. It wasn't love at first sight, it was curiosity, a slow unfolding. Two people orbiting each other in dorm hallways and crowded lectures until it became easier to sit together than apart. They built something honest back then, didn't they? Or at least it felt that way, because love at 20 doesn't come with caution signs or expiration dates. It comes with late-night walks across campus and laughter over takeout boxes and conversations about what life might look like if they ever made it out of that small college town. He wanted to be a writer, she wanted to teach. And together they mapped out futures like they had the power to bend time in their favor. Marcia still remembered the way he looked at her when he read her his first short story, nervous, proud, like she was the only one who could validate his voice. And in return, she gave him everything, her attention, her faith, her whole heart wrapped in trust and wide-eyed belief. 3 years later, he proposed under the cherry blossoms in the university's garden, a place they'd once gone to skip class and pretend the world didn't need them yet. He knelt with a trembling hand and a ring that wasn't expensive but was chosen with care, and she cried. Not because she was surprised, but because some part of her had been waiting for that moment since the second time he'd kissed her in the rain outside her dorm. The answer was yes before he even finished asking. They graduated a month later and moved into a tiny apartment that smelled like fresh paint and burnt toast, where everything they owned could fit in the backseat of their car, and they didn't care, because love made the space feel bigger. They made promises in that place, the kind that echo long after they're broken, promises about forever, about family, about showing up when things got hard. Nicholas would come home late from his job at the publishing house, and Marcia would be there with tea and questions about his day, and he used to look at her like she was the thing that grounded him, like the chaos of the world only made sense when she was near, but somewhere along the way, something shifted, and the glances stopped being filled with wonder and started carrying weight. It wasn't sudden, not really, more like a slow erasure. Marcia began noticing the silence first. The way he stopped sharing the little things, how his phone seemed to live face down, how his smile showed up for strangers more than it did for her. There were signs, and maybe she ignored them. Maybe she believed in the man she met under cherry blossoms more than the man who came home smelling like perfume that wasn't hers. But love does that, doesn't it? It blinds you with memories when reality starts getting ugly. And then came the shift that couldn't be ignored. The new assistant at the publishing house, the blonde with a laugh that made people turn their heads, the woman Marcia caught in his Instagram stories even after he said he worked late alone. He didn't confess, not at first. He just denied until the lies tangled so tightly around themselves they snapped. The confrontation wasn't explosive. It was quiet, devastatingly quiet. The kind of conversation where you already know the truth, but you ask anyway, hoping desperately for a different version. And when Nicholas finally admitted it, he didn't cry, didn't beg, just looked away and said he didn't feel the same anymore. Imagine that, spending years becoming someone's home, only for them to hand you the keys back and walk into another address without looking back. The proposal under the cherry blossoms, the whispered dreams, the vows they hadn't even gotten the chance to make. All of it erased in favor of someone new, someone shiny, someone who didn't know him in the dark, and yet, Nicholas moved on with a kind of speed that felt cruel. Like love had an expiration date that only he was aware of. Do you believe people can truly fall out of love, or do they just forget how to hold on? Leave a comment if you've ever seen someone you loved become a stranger in their own skin, because that's what it felt like for Marcia. Like the man who once read her poetry and kissed her shoulder while she graded papers had been replaced by someone colder, someone with a new future in mind that didn't include her, and just like that, the life they'd built crumbled quietly, without a bang. Just a series of closing doors and unread messages. But life, as cruel as it can be, doesn't always end things cleanly. Sometimes it leaves threads untied. Sometimes it leaves you pregnant and alone with memories that won't let go. And the worst part isn't even the heartbreak. It's the fact that you still remember how it felt to be chosen, how it felt to be loved before everything fell apart. That's the part that lingers, the part that makes the next chapter so difficult to write. Because how do you tell a story when the ending was stolen from you? And worse, rewritten by the very person who once promised to build it with you. And yet, as Marcia stood at that wedding, pregnant with a child of the man marrying someone else, she didn't just remember the history. She carried it, every word, every promise, every kiss, like a melody no one else could hear. But they were about to The moment the song began, the one she would eventually sing in that room full of strangers and ghosts, all Marcia could think about was how the unraveling had started, not with honesty or even confrontation, but with an image on a screen that felt like a slap. It wasn't a confession or a message or a tearful admission of guilt. It was an Instagram story, just 15 seconds long, that shattered 3 years of marriage with more force than any spoken betrayal ever could. Nicholas had been tagged by someone Marcia didn't know, but the second she tapped into the story and saw his arm around another woman's waist, champagne in hand, his smile easy, his lips brushing her cheek like he'd done to Marcia 1,000 times before, everything went numb. He didn't even try to hide it, didn't even flinch. The caption read "Power Couple Energy," and it was taken at a gala he said he couldn't take her to because it was a work-only event. And while she sat at home with swollen ankles, pregnant and exhausted, folding baby clothes in silence, he was out in public introducing his new relationship to the world without even the decency of telling his wife that she was no longer part of the narrative. Imagine that kind of erasure. Not just betrayal, but being replaced so casually, so confidently, like she was a chapter he'd already finished, and now he was showing off the sequel. There was no apology, not even a text to explain the photo. The silence that followed was louder than any fight they had ever had. Marcia waited, checked her phone too many times, convinced herself there had to be a misunderstanding. Maybe it was just a bad angle. Maybe he was caught off guard. Maybe there was some rational explanation she just hadn't heard yet. But no explanation came, only more posts, more stories, more tagged photos. And with every one, the truth dug deeper. Nicholas wasn't slipping into someone else's arms by accident. He had leapt. She called him once, twice, 5 times, and each time it went to voicemail. By the 6th time the mailbox was full, and the reality began to settle into her bones. Her husband wasn't coming home. Not physically, not emotionally, not in any way that mattered. He had ghosted her. Not a date, not a fling, not a friend. His wife, the woman carrying his child. The person who had stood beside him through every fragile chapter of his so-called creative genius and sleepless ambition. All of it. Discarded like it never happened. And the worst part was, he didn't even seem to care. Because that's what it was like for Marcia. Not just heartbreak but humiliation. Not just abandonment but deletion. Every part of their relationship scrubbed clean from his profile. Their wedding photos gone, her birthday posts erased, their anniversary trips vanished like a magician's trick, as if she had been a placeholder, not a partner. When she finally showed up at his office 2 weeks later, swollen and shaken, she wasn't there for drama. She just needed answers, closure, something human. But Nicholas wouldn't come down to see her, the receptionist, young, nervous, clearly uncomfortable, just handed her an envelope, no eye contact, no compassion. Inside was a separation agreement, already signed on his side. Like he was crossing her off a list before lunch. And that was the moment the switch flipped, not just inside her, but in the way she saw the world. It wasn't just that he left, it was how he did it. Cold, clinical, cowardly. Like a man who never really intended to stay forever, just until something shinier came along. And now he had it, or thought he did, because that woman, the one in the photo, would soon learn what it felt like to love a man who only loved himself in the mirror of your devotion. Marcia didn't sign the papers right away. She let them sit on her kitchen table while she tried to breathe, tried to sleep, tried to figure out how to move forward with a baby and a bruised heart. And when the silence got too loud, she wrote, not for him, but for herself, poured everything into the notebook she used to keep poems in, turned her pain into lyrics, her sorrow into melody. Because if Nicholas wanted to rewrite history, then she would write something new, not to win him back, not to prove anything, but to remember who she was before he tried to erase her. And as the weeks passed and her body changed and the child inside her grew, so did something else. Resolve, the kind that burns low but steady, the kind that doesn't scream but waits patiently for the moment when the world will stop and listen. Because there's something sacred about truth wrapped in sound, about pain turned into performance, and she knew, even then, that if she ever had the chance to speak, to sing, she would not whisper. So when that invitation arrived, with its calligraphy and glitter and fake grace, she saw it for what it was. Not an olive branch, not peace, but a provocation, a performance request disguised as sentiment. Nicholas didn't want reconciliation, he wanted a show, and what he didn't realize was that Marcia had already written one. And she wouldn't just show up, she would burn down the lie he built with every word she sang. 3 weeks after she finally gave in and signed those papers, fingers trembling but head held high, Marcia sat alone on the bathroom floor, knees pressed to her chest, the white stick clutched in her hand like some cruel joke from the universe. The second pink line was faint at first, then darkened slowly, like it was gaining confidence, confirming what her body had already been whispering. Nausea that lingered past breakfast. Exhaustion that felt like grief. A quiet knowing she had tried to ignore, Maybe because some part of her already sensed that the news would never be received as joy, not by him. She didn't cry, not at first, just stared at the test and let the silence wrap around her like a cold blanket. Her world had already cracked in half, and now somehow, it felt like the ground had opened beneath her completely. Not because she didn't want the baby. No, she already loved it, even in that moment, fiercely, protectively. But because she had to decide if this tiny heartbeat deserved to be linked to a man who had already chosen to vanish. She sat on the edge of that decision for 2 days, heart-torn between anger and obligation, between protecting herself and giving Nicholas the chance to be something better than what he'd shown her, and maybe that's what made her do it. The quiet hope that when faced with fatherhood, even a broken man might find a reason to rise. So she called, just once, and to her surprise, he answered. There was no small talk, no apology, just a short clip hello that sounded more like a mistake than a greeting. She told him calmly, clearly, said the words without trying to dress them up in fear or drama. I'm pregnant, she said, and it's yours. And for a heartbeat on the other end, she thought maybe he'd go quiet in shock. Maybe he'd ask if she was okay, if she needed anything. But instead there was laughter. Not the kind that comes from joy, but the sharp kind that slices through the phone and leaves a scar. His response, casual, heartless, still echoes in her memory like a line from a bad play. Not my problem anymore, followed by a click that ended more than just a call. It ended the illusion that he had ever been a man capable of love that didn't serve himself first. Have you ever given someone a chance to rise, only to watch them sink deeper instead, to hand them an opportunity to show up, and instead they run? Comment if you've ever trusted someone with something sacred and watched them treat it like nothing. Because for Marcia, that moment was a turning point, not just because it confirmed what she feared, but because it clarified everything she needed to become. She wasn't going to beg, not for help, not for money, not for presents. She wouldn't chase him through courtrooms or throw stones across social media. She would raise her child with or without his name on the birth certificate, because the life growing inside her deserved more than the echo of a man who turned his back on truth. The months that followed were heavy, not just with the weight of pregnancy, but with the weight of silence, of questions, of learning how to navigate doctor appointments alone, to hear heartbeats without a hand to hold, to choose nursery colors without someone to share the joy with. And through it all, she kept writing, kept singing softly in the shower, melodies born from midnight fears and daylight courage, and the song, the one she would eventually sing, began to form not in one sitting, but in fragments, in breaths, in moments when the world felt too big and she needed to shrink it down to something she could control. It was never meant for anyone else, not originally. It was a lullaby to the child she hadn't yet met, a letter written in rhythm, a love note in disguise. But as the baby grew, so did the ache for justice, for release, for truth, and slowly, those lyrics twisted into something else. Not bitterness, not vengeance, but a reckoning, and by the time her due date hovered on the horizon, so did the wedding invitation. And suddenly, the two things felt intertwined. There's something wildly ironic about receiving an invitation to the celebration of the very man who told you your child wasn't his concern, wrapped in golden ribbon, addressed with your full name as if you were just another guest, and then to open it and find a personal note asking if you'd perform, as if she were a hired act, not the woman he left behind, as if she should step onto his perfect stage and sing him into his new chapter, pretending hers hadn't already begun in shadow. She almost didn't go, not because she didn't want to, but because she wasn't sure she could stomach the sight of him standing at the altar without feeling like the floor would drop out again. But then she looked at her reflection in the mirror, saw the curve of her belly, the fire in her eyes, and realized this wasn't about him anymore. She wasn't showing up to be seen, she was going to be heard, not for applause, not for sympathy, but because she had something to say that no one else could say for her. And if he wanted a performance, well, he should have been more careful about who he handed the mic to. Because sometimes, the songs that haunt you the longest are the ones you never thought you'd hear. For months drifted by like fog across a field, slow and heavy, thick with silence and unwanted memories. The days stretched between doctor's visits, the rearrangement of a future she hadn't planned to navigate alone, and the soft flutter of tiny kicks that reminded her she was never truly by herself. The world outside continued to move. Couples strolled through parks, wedding announcements filled her feed, and the man who once promised forever had gone eerily quiet. No calls, no texts, not a single word since the day he shrugged off fatherhood like it was a coat he didn't want to wear anymore. And then, out of nowhere, it arrived. The envelope was elegant, expensive even, the kind that felt heavier than it should, like it came laced with intention. Her name sat on the front in that familiar handwriting, sharp, slanted, confident, the kind of script that once signed love notes and now signed away commitment. She stared at it for a long moment, heart paused somewhere between confusion and curiosity. Her fingers hesitated before pulling the flap open. Something in her already knew this wasn't going to be simple, not from him. Inside was an invitation, pure white with embossed lettering that seemed to mock her with every flourish. Nicholas Harrell cordially invites you to celebrate the beginning of forever. The date stamped in gold. The location some vineyard that had been on their bucket list once upon a time, back when someday felt like a promise instead of a punchline. And tucked inside, like a second layer of audacity, was a smaller folded card. Handwritten, no formality, no hesitation. It'd mean a lot if you sang something. 9 words, but every one of them cracked open a different kind of disbelief. Who does that? Who looks at the woman they abandoned, visibly pregnant with their child, and thinks, you know what would be great? If she performed at my wedding, it was surreal, insulting, but mostly it was revealing, because this wasn't about music, not really. This was about image, control, the need to appear evolved and unbothered. The kind of man who invites his ex to the wedding to prove how emotionally mature he is, even if everything about it reeks of cruelty. And yet, she didn't rip the card in half. She didn't throw it in the trash or burn it in some cinematic blaze of defiance. She placed it on the counter beside her prenatal vitamins and stared at it for 2 days straight. Not because she didn't know what to do, but because she needed to understand what it stirred in her. Not rage, not grief, something sharper, colder, like resolve wearing new skin. Comment if you've ever received a message that should have broken you but instead made you stand taller, because that's what this moment was for Marcia. Not an invitation but a mirror, showing her the person she no longer was. She wasn't the girl who cried on the bathroom floor, or the woman who begged for answers he'd never give. She was the one who survived it, grew through it, and now carried not just a child but a story that deserved to be heard. She reread his note again, tasting the entitlement in it, the way he assumed she'd say yes, the way he probably imagined her standing there, singing something sweet and forgettable, blending into his curated perfection like a footnote dressed in red. And maybe, just maybe, he thought having her there would complete the performance. The ex-wife singing at the altar while he pledged himself to someone new. It would be poetic, wouldn't it? The kind of twist that made him look like the bigger person. But what Nicholas didn't know, what he could never understand, was that Marcia had already written her own ending. She called the number on the RSVP card and left a message confirming her attendance. Voice calm, composed, unwavering. She didn't say anything about the song. Not yet. That part was sacred. The surprise he would never see coming. She had already started rehearsing. Not with a band. Not in a studio. Just in her living room. Baby kicks keeping rhythm while she poured her heart into lyrics that didn't soothe but seared. And when the day finally arrived, she chose the red dress with intention. Not just for its color but for what it symbolized. Power, defiance, the refusal to fade into the background. It was a shade that dared people to look, dared them to ask questions, dared them to remember, because she wasn't going to walk into that vineyard like a shadow, she was going to walk in like a reckoning. The car ride there was quiet, peaceful even, as if her soul had made peace with the storm it was about to unleash. She arrived just after the guests began settling, heels clicking against stone like a warning bell. Conversations dipped to whispers as heads turned, eyes widened, and silence wrapped the courtyard like a curtain waiting to be drawn. And there he was, Nicholas, standing by the altar, a man dressed in white, smiling too wide, too smug, like he'd already won. Like the presence of the woman he discarded only amplified his narrative of control. He waved when he saw her, as if they were old friends, as if their story hadn't ended with abandonment and a slammed door. And she smiled back, not because she felt joy, but because she knew something he didn't. Because that's what Marcia felt as she took her seat near the front, her dress catching light, her heartbeat steady, her voice, quiet for now, waiting for the moment it would cut through the noise. And when that moment came, when Nicholas tapped the microphone and said her name like it still belonged to him, when the guests turned with polite interest, expecting a love song or a safe ballad, she stood slow and sure, every step echoing through the stillness, holding not just a song but a truth that no one else in that vineyard was prepared to hear. Because this wasn't just music, this was memory sharpened into melody. This was the storm behind the silence finally speaking. And she wasn't here to be part of his performance, she was here to end it. There was a time when singing was the only way Marcia knew how to breathe. Back before betrayal changed the shape of her voice, before heartbreak made every note feel like a lie stuck in her throat. She used to walk through life with a melody tucked beneath her tongue, humming as she folded laundry, sang along to the radio while driving with the windows down. Once upon a time she even dreamed of stages, small ones at first. Open mics in cafes with fairy lights and scratched wooden stools, then bigger ones, maybe, theaters with warm acoustics and people who listened with their eyes closed. Nicholas knew that dream. In fact, he had been the one who first told her she had something rare. He used to record her on his phone when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Used to say her voice sounded like the first morning after a storm. Quiet, clean, full of something you couldn't name but didn't want to stop feeling. And back then, she believed him, not just because she wanted to, but because his belief gave her courage. And when you're in love, You borrow bravery from the people who say your name like it matters. But heartbreak has a way of stealing sound. It doesn't do it all at once. It takes it in pieces. First the hums disappear, then the spontaneous notes, and before long, the silence becomes normal, a quiet that settles into your skin like dust, unnoticed until it's everywhere. After he left, Marcia didn't sing for months, not even under her breath, not even in the shower. Music felt like a wound she didn't know how to touch. Every chorus reminded her of a life she couldn't go back to. Every lyric tasted like promises he never kept. She told herself it was temporary, that her voice was just resting, but deep down she wondered if it had vanished completely, if grief had built a wall inside her throat too high to climb. And yet, during those long nights with one hand resting on her belly and the other gripping a pencil, she began to write again, not with performance in mind, but with survival, each verse a piece of pain released, each line a confession she couldn't speak out loud, and slowly, without her noticing, melody began to return, not as a roar, but as a whisper, steady and soft, like an old friend knocking on a door that had been locked too long. The first time she sang the new song aloud, she cried halfway through it, not because it was sad, but because it sounded like her again, different, yes, wiser, heavier, edged with sorrow, but still her. And that was the moment she realized heartbreak hadn't stolen her voice. It had simply reshaped it, made it deeper, made it stronger, and Nicholas, in all his arrogance, had no idea what kind of voice he had summoned when he asked her to perform. Can you imagine being underestimated by someone who once claimed to know you better than anyone else, someone who thought they could predict your every move, only to find out you've become someone they can't even recognize? Comment if you've ever shocked someone with the strength they thought you'd lost. Because Marcia was no longer the girl who needed his approval to sing, she was the woman who had turned her silence into an anthem. As she stepped toward the small platform near the altar, the murmurs began again, low and uncertain, people shifting in their seats, eyes following her like they were waiting for a misstep, expecting something soft and forgettable. But Marcia didn't flinch, didn't pause. Her hands were steady, her breathing slow, the microphone felt cool in her grip but not unfamiliar, like a truth she'd once buried and was now ready to hold. Nicholas watched from the edge of the crowd, expression unreadable, one hand resting on his new bride's back, a smile pulled tight at the corners, and Marcia saw it for what it was. Control, composure, the desperate need to maintain the illusion, but that smile wouldn't last, not once she opened her mouth. The first note floated into the air like smoke, delicate but deliberate, not a question but a statement, the kind that makes conversations die mid-sentence. And within seconds, the room shifted, something in the air tightened, as if every molecule leaned in to listen, and just like that, she had them. The melody didn't chase approval, it didn't bend for comfort, it told a story, her story. In every note, every rise and fall, and with each word, her voice didn't just carry sound, it carried weight. And as she moved through the verses, something rare happened in that vineyard. Silence bloomed, thick and reverent, the kind you only hear in churches or funerals or moments that change people forever. And through it all, Nicholas didn't move, his smile gone, his posture stiff, as if every lyric peeled back another layer of the version of himself he wanted the world to believe. And his bride, once glowing with the confidence of someone who thought she won, now sat with her hands folded too tightly, jaw clenched, eyes no longer on Marcia but on the man beside her. Have you ever witnessed a room shift not because of volume but because of truth? Not because someone yelled, but because they simply told a story so real it couldn't be ignored. If you've ever watched someone reclaim their power in a moment designed to weaken them, let me know in the comments, because what Marcia was doing wasn't just singing, it was revealing. She didn't need to scream or shout or name names. The lyrics did the work, and her voice, the very thing he once praised, then ignored, then tried to use for his own show, had become the weapon he never saw coming. Because you can silence someone's presence, but not their voice, not when it's risen from the ashes of everything you tried to bury. They had called it a special musical tribute, printed on the program like a last-minute surprise meant to delight. Something light and sentimental wedged between the vows and the first dance, just a quiet offering from the past, a nostalgic nod to old friends and simpler times, the kind of thing that made guests smile politely and lean in with mild curiosity. Not one of them expected what followed, not even close, and that was exactly how Nicholas planned it. He didn't warn anyone, didn't whisper a single hint to the wedding planner or his bride or the guests sipping rose under fairy lights, because for him, this wasn't about music, it was about control, about stage managing his own narrative to the very end. The groom with a messy past now so mature, so evolved, that even his ex-wife had agreed to perform at his wedding. The image would be perfect, rehearsed without rehearsal. A scene so wildly self-serving he likely saw it as genius. But the thing about manipulating people who've already survived you is that they no longer play their parts. Marcia had been sitting off to the side, eyes focused, face unreadable, the red fabric of her dress cutting through the sea of soft blush tones like a flame someone forgot to put out. She didn't fidget or hide, she just waited, steady and patient, like a storm that knows its own schedule. And when the moment came, when the violinist nodded toward the microphone and Nicholas stepped forward to make the introduction, the crowd leaned in with just enough curiosity to make the silence that followed feel dense. He said her name like it meant nothing, just a syllable from another chapter. The audience stirred, some surprised, others confused, but no one more than the bride, her smile faltering for just a breath, her fingers stiffening against her bouquet, and still Nicholas continued, wrapping his arm around her shoulder like a magician revealing the final trick. An old friend, he said, someone who means a great deal to me. And then he handed Marcia the mic with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. Marcia rose slowly, her hand steady as it took the mic, and in that instant, the entire courtyard seemed to inhale, as if the air had turned into something sharper, something that cut the second it touched your lungs. Every eye followed her steps, every whisper stopped mid-sentence, the kind of pause that happens when something inside you knows instinctively that the world is about to shift. She didn't look at Nicholas, not directly, not yet. Instead her gaze passed over the guests, over the woman at the altar who now held herself just a bit tighter, over the officiant who suddenly looked unsure of what to do with his hands, and then, finally, over the microphone in her palm. And when she lifted her head and parted her lips, it wasn't music that filled the space. Not yet, it was presence. Undeniable and unshaken. The kind that makes people stop sipping their wine and lean just a little closer. Nicholas stood beside his bride with the posture of a man convinced he was witnessing something sentimental, maybe even redemptive. He didn't see the shift, didn't recognize the storm that had entered the room in silence and now stood inches from the truth. Maybe he thought she would sing something safe, something that painted him as a chapter closed gently, with grace and forgiveness and a sigh, but Marcia wasn't interested in comfort. Not anymore. What would you do if someone tried to turn your pain into their spotlight? Would you let it slide, or would you step into that light and own every piece of what they thought you'd hide? Let me know in the comments, because Marcia didn't come to soothe his ego, she came to speak, and not in whispers. The intro was slow, deliberate, one hand on the microphone, the other resting just above the curve of her belly, and as the first note flowed out, it wasn't soft, it was clean, powerful, the kind of tone that doesn't ask for permission, it simply claims space. Every lyric that followed landed like a confession, not from her, but from the memory of what he had done, painted in melody so honest it stung. She wasn't attacking, she wasn't accusing, but she didn't need to. The truth was threaded into the verses, worded in ways that danced on the edge of poetry and pain, describing moments only two people in that courtyard truly understood, and yet every person watching knew exactly what they were witnessing, because some truths don't need names, they only need to be said. Nicholas's smirk faded somewhere around the second chorus, replaced by a tension that pulled at his jaw, and his bride, the woman with a perfect posture and polished smile, now sat frozen, her eyes darting between the man beside her and the woman with the mic, trying to decide which version of him to believe. The performance didn't ask for applause, didn't bend toward entertainment, it demanded acknowledgement, it invited judgment, not for drama but for truth, and by the final note, the air was still again, not because nothing had happened, but because something too big to process had just unfolded in front of them. And Marcia, without bowing, without waiting for a response, stepped back and handed the microphone to the stand like it was never his to give, because what she gave that day wasn't a tribute, it was a reckoning. And Nicholas, for the first time in years, had nothing left to say. The microphone barely whispered as Marcia adjusted it, just a gentle click against the stand, yet the sound cut through the courtyard like thunder, not because it was loud, but because it marked the beginning of something that no one, not a single soul seated before her, was prepared to feel. Her eyes didn't search for faces or approval, she looked inward, steady and grounded, her hand resting above her unborn child as if to say, "This is for both of us." The first note didn't rush, it emerged like breath in winter, soft and cold, visible in the way it made shoulders drop and spine straighten. It wasn't timid, though some might have mistaken it for fragility, it was haunting. Not spooky, not theatrical. Haunting in the way a memory wraps around you late at night. The way a scent can transport you back to a moment you never wanted to relive. It was the kind of sound that silences conversations mid-word and slows time down to a heartbeat. Nicholas didn't blink, or maybe he did, but it didn't matter, because for the first time since she'd arrived, his confidence began to falter, not in great dramatic waves, but in tiny shifts. The way his smile didn't quite hold, the twitch in his jaw, the way he shifted his weight from one polished shoe to the other like the ground beneath him had gone uneven, and Marcia didn't need to look at him to feel it, she could sense it. The unraveling of a man who thought he was still in control. Each lyric that followed built slowly, like raindrops gathering into a flood, and while her voice grew louder, it didn't shout, it didn't force. It commanded, There's a difference between volume and presence, and Marcia had the latter in every syllable. Every rise and fall of the melody told a story not written on the program, a truth not captured in wedding photos or filtered posts. It was raw, but never chaotic. It was hurt, shaped into grace, sharpened into precision, and no one could look away. And his bride, once poised and polished in her designer lace and picture-perfect curls, sat perfectly still, too still. Her smile dropped around the second verse. When the lyrics stopped sounding like metaphor and started sounding like memory, there was a line, one line, where Marcia's voice dipped just slightly, and in that dip was something unmistakable, a name, not spoken directly, but carved between words so carefully it felt accidental. But it wasn't. Nothing about this performance was accidental. The bride's hand, once delicately placed on Nicholas's arm, withdrew slightly, her fingers now gripping the side of her chair instead, and though she tried to keep her expression neutral, her eyes gave her away. Eyes don't lie the way mouths do, and hers were wide, uncertain, searching, not at Marcia but at the man beside her, the man who told her this would be a beautiful tribute from an old friend, a sweet gesture of closure. And now she was sitting in the middle of what looked a lot more like exposure than ceremony. Nicholas shifted again, his breath caught briefly. Not quite a gasp, but almost, as though his own lungs had turned on him, because even if no one else understood every lyric, he did. And the words that floated through the air carried pieces of his past like broken glass in soft hands. Marcia was holding nothing back. Yet she wasn't accusing. She was simply telling the truth, her truth, wrapped in harmonies that didn't need to shout to pierce. There's something extraordinary about the way truth sounds when it's sung instead of spoken. Something in it bypasses logic and goes straight to the spine. And this crowd, this carefully curated assembly of smiles and champagne flutes, was no longer clapping along. They were listening fully, deeply, as if their souls leaned forward before their bodies did. And Marcia kept going, not because she had something to prove, but because she had something to release. This wasn't revenge, this wasn't spectacle, it was revelation. And in revealing her own pain, she was pulling back the curtain on a man who had been hiding in plain sight, dressed in charm and clever words, masked in charisma, but now bare in the echo of every verse. Comment if you've ever seen someone try to hide behind a smile and get caught in their own performance, because Nicholas had spent years building a facade. But facades crack when exposed to truth, and Marcia's voice was not just music, it was light, the kind that seeps into places even the best lies can't cover. And when she reached the final bridge, the part of the song that held no forgiveness, no wrapping paper to soften the blow, her voice didn't tremble, it soared, like it knew that the silence afterward would never be the same. And it wasn't, because even as the last note floated into the night, no one moved, no one clapped, they just sat there, hearts pounding, minds racing. Faces pale with the realization that they had just witnessed something that wasn't supposed to happen at weddings. Because sometimes the most powerful sound isn't applause, it's the silence left behind when the truth finishes speaking. If this already made your heart pause, if it made you shift in your seat or hold your breath just a little longer than you meant to, you need to stay with me, because what came next wasn't just a moment. It was the unraveling of an entire story, not with screams or accusations, but with verses that hit like confessions stitched into melody. Because that song Marcia sang wasn't one she pulled off a shelf. It wasn't a cover or a borrowed track, it was hers, word for word, emotion for emotion. Written in the late night hours when the house was too quiet, when grief kept her company and pain sharpened her pen. This wasn't just a performance, it was a reckoning, the kind that makes time stretch, that pulls the rug out from under polished lies and forces people to see what they never wanted to believe. Nicholas thought she'd sing something pretty, something sad but safe, but what she delivered was the truth dressed in poetry. And the moment it landed, it didn't fade, it echoed through the trees, through the champagne glasses still sweating in the hands of stunned guests, through the forced smiles of people now realizing they were seated at the center of something unraveling right before their eyes. And if this already has you hooked, if you're sitting there thinking this can't possibly get worse, just wait. The song she wrote wasn't only for release, it was for clarity, for witness, for justice. Because sometimes the only way to make people see is to sing the things they pretend not to hear. Subscribe if you're still breathing after this, because the ending hasn't arrived yet, and trust me, you won't want to miss how it all comes apart. Now here's what none of them knew, not even the ones closest to Nicholas. Not the best man standing too still, not the parents holding tight to their wine, and certainly not the bride who now watched her groom with wide eyes and tight lips. This wasn't some coincidence, it wasn't an impulsive act. The song had been carefully crafted over weeks, every line designed not just to hurt but to reveal, and every lyric was a thread pulled from the truth he tried to bury. Marcia had written it from the center of her heartbreak, in those early mornings when sleep slipped away and the baby moved like a reminder of everything she'd been left to carry. The verses weren't abstract or poetic for poetry's sake. They were sharp, specific, intimate, Too intimate to be fiction, too personal to be about anyone else. They held details no stranger could know, like the first time she saw the texts from another woman on his phone, the lie he told about the business trip that wasn't, the night he left without saying goodbye while she was still asleep. They weren't just lyrics, they were timestamps. You loved me until it cost you comfort. That line, quiet but brutal, slid through the crowd like a scalpel, and everyone felt it, not just as a lyric, but as a mirror, because who hasn't loved someone until it got inconvenient, until it asked for something hard, something real, and there it was, spelled out in 6 words, the real reason he left, the truth behind the silence. The justification he would never say aloud, but had finally been said for him. Have you ever heard a line so true it made your skin feel too tight, like your body knew it before your brain could catch up? If that line hit you too, let me know, because that lyric, that one sentence, made shoulders slump and heads drop, made people turn and glance at one another in slow realization. Because it wasn't just a song anymore, it was testimony, and Marcia had delivered it without apology. The second verse cut even deeper, wrapped in metaphor but rooted in reality. She sang about being a house someone moved into and abandoned without packing, about love used like furniture until it no longer matched the decor of a new life. And when she reached the bridge, her voice dipped lower, quieter, not because she lost strength but because she wanted them to lean in, wanted them to feel the quiet devastation of the line that followed. You built a future on the ashes of the one we lit together. The audience didn't move, some of them couldn't. It was the kind of stillness you only see at funerals or when someone's name is read out in court, that pause when reality finally connects to consequence. And Nicholas, standing front and center, had nowhere left to look, not even at the woman beside him who now shifted just out of reach. Because the song didn't leave space for denial, it didn't give him room to rewrite or revise, it told the story exactly as it happened. Not bitterly, not violently, just truthfully, and sometimes the truth is the most devastating sound of all. Marcia didn't break eye contact with the crowd as she reached the last line, her voice unwavering, her presence unshaken, and the final lyric fell like the softest kind of thunder. You called it closure, I call it a stage. And just like that, the music stopped. And in that silence, something cracked. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. Like the faint sound of a thread snapping inside the hem of a dress. Like a seam that had been pulled too tight for too long. And now, finally, couldn't hold. Marcia stood still, chest rising and falling steadily. The mic now quiet in her hand as her final words hung in the air like the scent of rain after a fire. And the crowd, still frozen from the weight of her truth, began to shift, slowly, awkwardly, like people waking from a spell they hadn't realized they were under. It started with a gasp, quiet but sharp, like someone had just realized they were witnessing something that wasn't meant to be witnessed. Then came the movement. Small at first, hands fidgeting in laps, a few cleared throats, a chair leg scuffing against the stone path. Then a woman near the back leaned toward the man beside her and whispered something neither of them would repeat later, not because they couldn't, but because some moments don't need to be explained, they just need to be survived. A middle-aged couple seated near the aisle didn't speak, didn't blink, they just stared forward, hands clasped too tightly. And though no one would say it aloud, it was obvious. They were doing the math, comparing Marcia's lyrics with things they'd heard, things they'd seen, and slowly, the illusion Nicholas had spent months crafting began to fracture, because it was no longer just a beautiful wedding on a vineyard. It was a confession dressed in lace and silk. The pastor, a man who had spoken earlier with such ease and warmth, now stood stiff behind his open book, his eyes darting from the bride to the groom to the woman in red who had just stolen the air from the ceremony. His fingers curled tighter around the pages, as if holding onto scripture could keep him from being swallowed whole by what had just happened. Even he knew, this wasn't about vows anymore, this was about revelation. And then, in perhaps the clearest signal that nothing could go back to the way it was, the groom's mother, a woman who had smiled all day, shaken hands, hugged strangers, poured wine like it was communion, stood up without a word, her face pale, her jaw set not in confusion, but in clarity, and she walked not hurriedly, not dramatically, but with purpose, her heels tapping against stone like punctuation marks in a sentence no one wanted to finish, and the guests parted for her like water, unsure whether to follow or freeze. Have you ever watched a room transform, not from decor or lighting, but from truth, from one sentence too honest to ignore, from a melody that made people remember everything they tried to forget? If you've ever seen a crowd collectively realize they've been clapping for the wrong story, tell me below, because that's what this was. Not a celebration, but a shift, a reckoning hiding in the skin of a ceremony. Marcia didn't cry, didn't shake, she just stepped away from the mic, each stride deliberate, measured. She didn't rush off like someone ashamed. She didn't look to Nicholas for any sign of how to react. She had no need to. She had already said everything without raising her voice. And in doing so, she had reclaimed not just her voice, but her presence. She hadn't come to destroy the wedding, she had come to tell the truth, and sometimes, the truth does the rest. Nicholas remained frozen, his hands at his sides, his posture betraying a stiffness that hadn't been there before. He didn't chase after Marcia, didn't speak to the guests, didn't even look at his bride, because he knew, and what he knew now, what they all knew, was that no amount of charm or curated appearances could silence what had just been sung. The performance had ended, but the consequences were just beginning. His bride, still seated, turned her gaze slowly toward him, and for a moment, the entire vineyard felt smaller, tighter, as if it couldn't contain both the truth and the lie at the same time. She didn't ask anything out loud. Her eyes did the work, searching his face for an answer, for a reaction, for some sign that what they'd all just heard wasn't real. But there was none, because how do you answer a song that holds your secrets? How do you deny lyrics that only two people know the weight of? And the guests, they didn't clap, they didn't toast, they didn't do anything at all, because they weren't sure what they were anymore, witnesses or accomplices or casualties of a love story gone wrong. They sat in that uncomfortable in-between where admiration meets guilt, where beauty meets consequence, where the ceremony turns into a courtroom without walls. Would you have stayed seated? Would you have spoken up? Would you have walked out like the mother of the groom, or stayed frozen like the pastor, unsure what role you were playing anymore? Let me know, because these are the moments that show us who we are when the script gets torn in half. And Marcia, as she reached the back of the courtyard, didn't look back, because she didn't need to see the damage to know it was done. Truth doesn't ask for permission, and it doesn't wait for applause. It just walks in, speaks, and walks out. And behind her, the wedding that once promised forever now stood trembling on the edge of silence. No longer a celebration, no longer a performance, only a reckoning that had been sung into existence, one lyric at a time. The quiet that followed Marcia's exit didn't stay gentle for long. It never does when truth leaves the room. It stirs everything behind it, like a gust through an open door. Nicholas stood there like a statue chipped at the edges, cracks spreading under the weight of what he couldn't control. And then it happened, the break, not physical at first, but visible in his posture, in the way his shoulders tightened and his hands curled into fists at his sides, like he was trying to hold the moment, together with the same grip that once held promises he never kept. He turned, sharp and stumbling, toward the mic still perched where she'd left it, its silence louder now than anything he could say, and without a word, he lunged forward and reached for the cord, tugging hard as if silencing the sound now could erase what had already been heard. But it was too late, the damage had already been done, and no amount of unplugging could unsing the truth. The guests flinched, not from the sound, there was none, but from the energy, the unraveling, the moment the perfectly polished man began to splinter under the pressure of exposure. His face flushed not from heat or embarrassment, but from panic, because this was never part of the script. This was the part he thought he could avoid with charm and curated grace. And now here he was, center stage with no mask left. "I gave you everything," he suddenly shouted, voice echoing awkwardly through the courtyard as though searching for something to land on. But there was no sympathy left to catch it, just blank stares and clenched jaws and the weight of too many truths sitting heavy in the air. And still he kept going, because sometimes when control slips, the only thing left is chaos dressed as defense. "She's lying," he added, but even he didn't sound convinced, his voice cracking under the weight of his own unraveling. "This wasn't the plan, she twisted it." He spun in place, looking for someone, anyone, to agree, to nod, to pretend they hadn't just heard exactly what they heard. But no one moved, no one blinked, and the silence that answered him was colder than Marcia's last note. His bride didn't stand, didn't speak. She just watched him with wide eyes that no longer saw the man she thought she was marrying. She saw something else now. Not a groom, not a partner, but a man caught midline with nowhere left to hide. And her bouquet, once held delicately like a promise, now lay forgotten on her lap, petals slowly falling, one by one, like something wilting under too much heat. Would you believe someone after that? Would you defend them if the song laid out every wound and every betrayal like a timeline built from truth? Let me know in the comments if you've ever watched someone you once trusted come undone trying to protect a version of themselves that no longer exists, because that's exactly what Nicholas was doing, trying to rewrite a story that had already been performed, in front of everyone. "She's bitter," he muttered next, "she just wants attention." But the more he spoke, the smaller his voice became, not because it was quiet, but because it had lost all weight. And when your words carry no truth, they can't carry power either. He turned to his best man, who wouldn't meet his gaze, then to his mother's empty seat, then finally back toward the path Marcia had walked down. And it was then, only then, that he saw her pause at the edge of the courtyard. She hadn't left yet. She stood there, back still straight, eyes forward, one hand resting calmly on her stomach as if the storm behind her hadn't touched her at all. And when Nicholas shouted once more, as if volume could erase vulnerability, "You think you're the only one who suffered," she finally turned. And she smiled. Not the smile of revenge, not a smirk born of triumph, but something softer, stronger, the kind of smile that says I made peace with this long before you knew it was coming. And in that look, she said more than any lyric ever could. She wasn't there to punish him, she was there to free herself. And in that moment, Nicholas stopped shouting. His arms fell slowly to his sides, his breath ragged, his chest rising and falling with the weight of realization, because he knew now, fully finally, that the version of himself he had tried to sell to the world had just been dismantled, note by note, and there was no saving it. Have you ever seen someone fall apart not because they were hurt, but because they got caught, because the truth stood taller than their excuses? If you've ever watched that moment, the shift from defiance to defeat, then you know exactly what this looked like. Nicholas, the man who built his new beginning on silence, now left speechless in the ruins of his own illusion. And as Marcia turned back around and walked away, there were no more protests, no more claims, just the sound of her heels against the stone path, steady, certain, and the echo of a man who had everything, except the one thing he couldn't steal back, the narrative. Because once someone finds their voice, there's no going back to silence. What no one knew, not the guests with their wine half-raised, not the groomsmen who now couldn't meet each other's eyes, not even the bride who still hadn't moved an inch, was that Marcia's voice had been there long before she ever stepped onto that stage. The performance they all witnessed was not a spontaneous act of emotion or vengeance. It wasn't born in the moment. It had been designed, crafted, rehearsed and prepared with a kind of care only someone who had been burned badly would. Dare take, the melody they just heard had not been performed for the first time on that vineyard stone. It had been performed weeks before, alone in a quiet studio where her tears didn't stain the lyrics, they sharpened them. You see, Marcia had recorded the song long before the day she arrived in Red, not for backup, not for safety, but for certainty, because she didn't trust the moment, didn't trust the mic, didn't trust Nicholas not to cut her off mid-verse or create some kind of technical failure masked as accident. And so, while the wedding planner sent her the itinerary and the programs were printed with her name listed as special tribute, Marcia made a phone call and booked a session, 1 hour, no frills. Just a microphone, a chair and her voice carrying every ounce of pain that hadn't been allowed to speak until now. And it wasn't just recorded, it was shared. Not publicly, not on social media, not on some streaming platform. That wasn't her goal. This wasn't about virality, it was about truth in the right ears. She sent it out the week before the ceremony, quietly, strategically, with no return address, just a plain flash drive in a silver envelope, marked with the words "for you" before the vows, and she sent them not to the entire guest list, not to tabloids or media outlets, but to very specific people, Nicholas's circle, the ones who had praised his new beginning without ever questioning how the last one ended. The bride's parents were among the first to receive it. They were already in town, staying at the estate, prepping for the final touches of the big day when the envelope arrived, slipped under their door with the morning breakfast tray, and when they opened it, curious but cautious, they played it on the laptop sitting between floral seating charts and RSVP spreadsheets, expecting maybe a song, maybe something sweet from a friend who couldn't attend, but what they heard wasn't a gift. It was a warning. The track began softly, same as it had at the ceremony, Marcia's voice rising from silence like mist, delicate but unmistakable, and as the lyrics unfolded, verse by verse, the mood in the room changed. What began as curiosity turned into something much colder, more urgent, because this wasn't a love song, it was a map of betrayal, and as the bride's mother listened, eyes narrowed, mouth tight, she didn't speak, didn't blink. She just pressed pause halfway through and asked her husband to step outside with her. The rest of the song played to an empty room, but it didn't need an audience to be understood. Some say they confronted Nicholas that same evening, pulled him aside during a toast rehearsal and asked him straight out if there was any truth to what they'd heard, and others, people closer to Marcia's quiet plan, believed they said nothing at all, chose silence over spectacle, not wanting to ruin the image they'd built, not ready to admit that their perfect son-in-law might have been lying from the start. But the truth has a strange way of waiting for the right moment. And when Marcia walked into that courtyard, microphone ready and red dress flowing like defiance stitched into fabric, they knew without question that the voice they had heard in private was about to become public, and all they could do was watch as the words they ignored were finally sung out loud. Nicholas didn't know the song had been heard before the wedding. He didn't know some guests had already recognized the melody as it began, that a few had shifted uncomfortably in their chairs before the first note even landed, and that his carefully curated performance had started to crumble before the first champagne toast. Because once the song existed, once it had been recorded and passed from hand to hand, the truth was already moving, quietly, slowly, like smoke under a closed door, waiting for the moment to burst through. Have you ever found out that the story you're being told has already been questioned behind closed doors, that the people clapping at your success were already whispering doubts? Let me know if you've seen it happen, because that's exactly what Nicholas missed. The way power slips away in silence first, before it ever collapses in noise. And as Marcia walked away from the mic that day, what she left behind wasn't just a memory or a scandal. It was a trail of receipts disguised as melody, and while she didn't stay to watch the fallout, she didn't have to. The echoes would carry her story longer than she ever needed to. Because once a truth is sung, it can't be unsung, not even by the people who heard it before the first "I do." There was a shift in the air during the final chorus, not just in the audience's energy, but in the tone of Marcia's voice. It was subtle, almost imperceptible unless you were really listening. But the final verse didn't just carry sadness or betrayal, it carried something colder, something heavier, something shaped like consequence, the kind that makes your stomach twist before your brain even catches up. Because buried inside those closing lines was a truth so carefully placed, so devastatingly intentional, that it didn't just sting, it exposed. What Marcia revealed in those last few lyrics wasn't about heartbreak or abandonment, it was about power, the kind that gets misused behind closed doors, dressed up in charm and authority, the kind that manipulates silence and weaponizes position, the kind of power Nicholas had worn like a second skin for years while pretending it was kindness. And for the first time, the song wasn't just about her. She shifted the spotlight in those final lines, and you could feel it, in the way the audience leaned forward without realizing, in how a few of the women exchanged glances that weren't confused, but knowing, like puzzle pieces quietly sliding into place. She was no longer singing about a man who left her for someone else. She was revealing a pattern, a behavior, something far deeper and more dangerous than emotional betrayal. Because the affair hadn't been simple, it hadn't been clean, and it hadn't started with love. It had started with power, with manipulation, with pressure disguised as affection and flattery disguised as opportunity. The lyrics didn't name names, but they didn't need to. The lines traced moments that anyone in the corporate world could recognize. Late-night meetings that didn't need to happen, compliments with undertones that lingered too long, promises of advancement offered in exchange for loyalty that wasn't professional. And when Marcia sang about the woman who came after her, the one who now wore white at the altar, she didn't accuse, she mourned, because what the bride didn't know, and what the guests were only now beginning to piece together, was that she wasn't the exception to a rule. She was just the most recent one convinced she was different. Can you imagine sitting at a wedding and realizing the vows being exchanged are built on the same lies told to someone else just months before? Comment below if you've ever watched someone think they found something real while everyone around them already knew the truth. Because that's what it looked like now. Not a celebration, but a carefully timed disaster unraveling in front of an audience that had been fooled by a smile. There was a woman in the third row who left halfway through the song, head down, jaw clenched, and no one asked where she was going because they already knew. She had worked with Nicholas, had shared stories about what a good man he was, had once laughed too loudly at his jokes in meetings that lasted too long, and now she was remembering things differently. Details that had once felt like nothing now landing with weight. Because Marcia wasn't just singing about herself anymore. She was holding a mirror up to a man who built his identity on being the kind of person everyone trusted, the safe one, the charming one, the one who always knew the right thing to say. And now suddenly, the way he had treated people behind closed doors didn't look like flattery anymore, it looked like grooming. And when she sang the line, the one that cracked the silence into something sharp, "You made careers your currency and hearts your playground," the entire atmosphere changed. Because that wasn't about love, it was about power, about abuse of it, and every person who had ever worked with him or under him or around him now had a reason to question what they saw and what they ignored. Marcia had chosen to make that truth public not to ruin him, but to protect others, because sometimes silence is a cage and song is the only way out. And once she had written it, once the lyrics were laid out and sung into the open, she couldn't pretend anymore, not for his sake, not for hers, and definitely not for the women who might come after. Because that's the weight Marcia carried while writing that song, the fear that speaking up would only bring more silence, but choosing to speak anyway. She didn't accuse Nicholas directly, not with names, not with titles, but the ones who knew, and more importantly, the ones who needed to know were finally listening, because the version of him that stood at that altar could no longer hide behind charm, not when the lyrics pointed to the shadow behind his smile. By the time the final note faded, the room didn't feel like a wedding anymore, it felt like a courtroom, not one with judges or gavels, but with witnesses, with evidence, with stories waiting to be told. And while Marcia didn't stay to answer questions or face the fallout, she didn't have to. Because the most dangerous truths aren't shouted in anger, they're sung softly in front of the very people who once thought they knew the whole story. And when that story turns out to be bigger than one heartbreak, bigger than one woman, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a reckoning. She had sat motionless for nearly every word, chin high, shoulders locked, eyes forward like a soldier trying not to flinch through friendly fire. But when the last note vanished and the silence settled like ash across the vineyard, something inside the bride began to unravel. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in quiet, visible cracks. It started in her hands, the way they twitched against the folds of her gown, then rose to her throat, where her breath stalled for just a moment too long. Like she couldn't swallow what she had just heard. And then, without a word, without a glance for the stunned crowd or even the officiant waiting helplessly between pages of vows now rendered meaningless, she reached up and tore the veil from her hair, not delicately, not carefully, but with the kind of fury that has nowhere else to go. The silk caught briefly on her earring, snagging for a second before it fell, and when it hit the ground, it sounded like punctuation, a period at the end of a lie that had gone on far too long. Gasps rippled across the rows, not just from the gesture, but from what it meant, because in that one motion, the fantasy shattered. The bride, once a glowing centerpiece of the celebration, was now something entirely different. She wasn't smiling anymore, wasn't performing anymore, she was awake, and when she turned to Nicholas, the expression she wore wasn't betrayal, it was disbelief. The kind that only comes when the truth catches you in public with nowhere to run. Her voice didn't rise above a whisper, but everyone heard it. Is it true? 3 words, barely spoken, but they carried more weight than any vow could ever hope to hold. She didn't ask for details, didn't need to know dates or names or how long it had gone on. She wasn't asking for explanation, she was asking for confirmation. Because deep down, part of her already knew, maybe not everything, maybe not the depth of it, but enough to recognize the pain she heard in Marcia's song was not fabricated, not imagined. It was too specific, too honest, too exact. And Nicholas, the man who had smiled through it all, who had orchestrated this day like a director trying to save a final act, stood still, hands slightly raised as if frozen mid-denial, and said nothing. He didn't shake his head, didn't step forward, didn't reach for her the way you'd expect someone to if they were being wrongly accused. He just stood there, mouth parted slightly, eyes flickering with panic that had nowhere to land. Because the thing about silence in a moment like that is that it becomes its own kind of confession. That was the answer. The bride stepped back once, then again, her heels crunching softly against the stone path, the hem of her dress catching on the edge of her shoe as she moved, the veil now forgotten in the dirt beside her. And the crowd didn't move, they couldn't. They were caught in the gravity of the moment, pulled between watching and wanting to disappear. Have you ever asked a question you already knew the answer to, not because you needed to hear it, but because you wanted to see if the other person had the courage to admit it? If you've ever stood in front of someone who proved you right by saying nothing at all, drop a comment, because those are the moments that don't just break hearts, they shatter illusions. And she wasn't crying, not yet, not in the way people expected. There were no sobs, no tears streaming down porcelain cheeks. What she felt was too raw for that. It was the ache behind the eyes that doesn't fall. It burns, it simmers, it becomes something you carry long after the moment ends. She looked at him one more time, but there was no plea in her eyes, no hope for a last-minute reversal. What she saw in Nicholas now wasn't the man she thought she was marrying. It was the man Marcia had described without ever using his name. And once you see someone clearly, once the veil drops in more ways than one, you can't unsee it. Her father stood slowly from the second row, his face unreadable, then reached for her hand, and for a second, she let him guide her away, her steps slow but sure, and just like that, the bride walked off the altar, not toward forever, but toward freedom. And the ceremony, if you could still call it that, had no more script to follow. The pastor closed his book, guests began to murmur, chairs creaked beneath the weight of people trying to decide if they should leave or stay, but the bride had already made her choice. She had walked away from a man who couldn't speak the truth, even when the truth was sung by someone he had tried to silence. Would you have done the same? Would you walk away from a life you were promised the moment you found out it was built on someone else's pain? Let me know, because it takes a different kind of strength to leave, not when you're angry, but when you're awake. And as she disappeared down the path Marcia had walked minutes earlier, there was no music to fill the space, no applause, just the weight of an ending that wasn't planned but was finally honest. Because sometimes, the most powerful vow is the one you never say. The wedding ended without a final word, no bouquet toss, no cake cutting, no slow dance under fairy lights, just the dull clinking of glass being cleared away and the awkward shuffle of guests trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. The once picture-perfect vineyard had turned into the ruins of a ceremony undone by a voice no one expected to hear, and by morning, the story had already started to travel. Not through gossip or tabloids just yet, but through whispers and side texts, hushed phone calls and sleepless retellings. Because you don't see a wedding fall apart like that and not tell someone. Nicholas tried to regain control, tried to call it a misunderstanding, told a few people it was performance art, that Marcia had exaggerated, that it wasn't real, that people misread what they heard. But it was too late. The guests hadn't just heard her lyrics. They had felt them, and the looks passed between them after the bride left said everything. No one was convinced by charm anymore. Not after the truth had been sung in real time under a sky that saw it all. And then the real fallout began. 3 days later, an email thread surfaced. An anonymous message circulated through the office Nicholas had once run like his personal stage. The subject line read, "Since you heard the song." And attached were screenshots, time-stamped messages, forwarded emails, evidence of whispered rumors now sharpened into proof. And once the door opened, more stories poured in. Former colleagues, junior staff, interns who had left early and never explained why, women who once laughed politely at his jokes, now finding the courage to say they never found them funny, just strategic, just manipulative. By the end of that week, Nicholas was placed on administrative leave. By Monday, he was let go entirely. The company released a statement full of corporate jargon, phrases like internal investigation, culture alignment, and moving forward with accountability. But everyone knew what had happened. The wedding song had started it, but the voices that followed had finished it. Meanwhile, Marcia didn't speak publicly, not right away, she didn't need to. Her song had already done the talking, and the video, recorded by a guest and uploaded with a vague title, "What Really Happened at That Wedding," hit 1 million views within the first day, not because it was sensational, but because it was real, because people recognized pain wrapped in poise, because the melody stayed in your chest long after the video ended. By the end of that week, it had reached 4 million, and Marcia's inbox flooded: publishers, producers, journalists, all asking the same thing in different ways. Would she tell her story again, but this time on their platform? Have you ever watched someone try to erase you only to realize they gave you the microphone? Let me know if you've ever seen someone try to silence a voice and end up broadcasting it instead, because that's exactly what Nicholas did when he invited Marcia to sing. He didn't just give her a mic, he gave her momentum. Within the month, she signed a book deal. It wasn't a tell-all, not a scandal memoir or a revenge blueprint. It was something deeper, something layered. Part memoir, part poetry, part guide for women learning to find their voice again after having it ignored for too long. She called it The Song He Didn't Write, and it sold out pre-orders before the cover was even revealed. She didn't name him in the book, just like she didn't name him in the song, but everyone who had been at the wedding knew, and more importantly, every woman who had been through something similar knew exactly who she was writing for. And that was the point. She wasn't trying to ruin him. She was building something beyond him. Comment if you've ever found healing in creating something from the pieces someone else tried to break. Because Marcia wasn't chasing applause, she was reclaiming authorship of her own narrative, and in doing so, she gave others permission to do the same. Nicholas, meanwhile, disappeared quietly. No apology, no statement, no video with dim lighting and tears, just silence. The same kind he had once used to ghost Marcia now returned to him like an echo, and as more stories surfaced, he learned what it felt like to be publicly uninvited from spaces he once walked through without question. The bride who walked away? She never went back. Sources say she canceled the honeymoon, deleted the engagement photos, and moved in with her sister while she rebuilt her life from scratch. She never spoke to the press, never made a scene, just picked up the pieces and kept moving, which is sometimes the strongest thing a person can do when the truth shatters everything you thought you knew. And while the world moved on to the next headline, Marcia's story didn't fade. Because her song wasn't just a viral moment. It was a mirror, held up for others to see their own stories, their own silence, their own power waiting to be reclaimed. It played on podcasts, on radio segments, in college lecture halls and empowerment workshops, not because it was flashy or shocking, but because it was honest, because it said the things too many people are too scared to say, and that kind of truth doesn't go out of style. So tell me, if someone handed you the mic, what would you say? Would you tell your truth, even if it made the room uncomfortable? Even if the people who once clapped for you stopped listening? Because when Marcia sang her story, the world didn't just hear it, it listened. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything. When Marcia finished her final note, she didn't wait, didn't look for approval or applause or even a reaction. The moment the last word slipped from her lips and dissolved into the air, she placed the microphone gently back onto the stand as if it was no longer hers to hold, as if the weight it had carried had finally been laid down, and without pausing, without turning back, she walked. She didn't make a scene, didn't rush or stumble. Her steps were slow, steady, deliberate, heels tapping against stone in rhythm with her breathing. And in that rhythm lived something that no one in the audience could quite explain. A silence more powerful than any roar, a stillness that echoed louder than anything she had just sung. Because that was the real moment, not the lyrics, not even the melody, but the 5 seconds after she stopped singing and said nothing at all. No one clapped, not because they didn't feel anything, but because they didn't know how to react to something that wasn't a performance. It was a release, a reckoning, and applause would have felt like trying to put a bow on a wound. So they just sat, frozen in that space between realization and regret, their eyes tracing her red dress as it moved through the courtyard like a final punctuation mark to a story they didn't know they were part of. And as Marcia passed the last row of chairs, something incredible happened, something no one would forget. People began to cry, quietly at first, the kind of crying that sneaks up on you, when a truth hits so close to home you can't keep it locked behind your ribs. A woman wiped tears with the back of her hand without looking away. A man cleared his throat but didn't speak, and someone near the back, someone who hadn't moved the entire song, bowed their head like they were praying. Because what Marcia left behind wasn't devastation, it wasn't chaos, it was clarity. She didn't scream, didn't demand justice or retaliation. She didn't call out names or ask for sympathy. Her power wasn't just in the song. It was in her refusal to plead, her refusal to shrink. She didn't stay to witness the fallout because she didn't need to. And that's what made it more powerful. She had already survived it once. And now, she wasn't asking anyone to believe her. She was simply letting the truth speak and walking away from the wreckage with her dignity untouched. Have you ever witnessed a moment so quiet it felt like the whole world was holding its breath? A moment when someone took every piece of pain they were given and set it down without needing to smash it or throw it back. Let me know if you've ever felt that shift, that invisible quake when someone takes their power back by choosing not to fight, but to walk away with their head high. Because that was the real 5-second moment. Not the high note or the line that landed like a knife, not the stares or the silence that followed. It was the pause, the breath she took after singing, the stillness between her last lyric and her first step away. That was where everything changed. That was the moment where control slipped out of Nicholas's hands and fell at her feet. And she didn't pick it up, she didn't need it anymore. There's something beautiful about restraint, about quiet defiance, about choosing to leave before anyone tries to tell you what you deserve. And that's what Marcia did. She didn't stay to defend herself, she didn't try to prove anything. She simply gave the truth and let it rest where it fell. People say strength looks like standing tall, like shouting back, but sometimes it looks like walking away with tears in your eyes and pride in your posture. It looks like being the one who chooses peace over spectacle, truth over attention, and healing over vengeance. And long after the guests packed up their doubts and their guilt, long after the chairs were folded and the wine dried on abandoned linens, long after the news articles and videos and headlines faded, that 5-second moment stayed, etched in memory, etched in hearts. Marcia never spoke to Nicholas again, never answered his texts, never responded to the letters he sent weeks later, asking for conversation, for context, for forgiveness, because she didn't owe him closure. She had already written her own, and it didn't require his permission. And if you're wondering what happened to her after that, if you're still holding onto the image of her disappearing down that path in the red dress that refused to be ignored, just know this: she didn't look back. She didn't need to.
Thanks so much for watching till the end. If this story moved you, you're going to love what's coming next. It's even more surprising and emotional than this one. Go ahead and click the story on your screen right now, and see you in the next story.